Welcome back. If you have been here for volumes 1 and 2, you already know this story from the inside. You know the childhood, the badge, the woman named Bonnie, and the long Sacramento summers when people slept with guns by their beds and locksmiths could not keep up with the demand. You know the names of the people who died in Southern California: Offerman, Manning, Smith, Harrington, Withun, Domingo, Sanchez, Cruz. You know how their families described finding out. You know how Michelle McNamara chased this case to the last weeks of her life and never got to see it end. Tonight, we arrive at the end. Or rather, the beginning of the end, which took years of its own. Tonight is about the science. About a retired patent attorney in California who thought she was going to spend her retirement playing tennis, who ended up changing the history of criminal investigation forever. About a team of investigators who spent months sitting quietly in cars outside a modest house in Citrus Heights, watching a 72-year-old man go about his day. About a Hobby Lobby arts and crafts store. About a car door handle. About a tissue in a trash can. About the moment on the morning of April 24, 2018, when officers walked up to a house on Canyon Oak Drive in Citrus Heights, Sacramento, and the 44-year hunt was over. The rain is on. Your breathing is already slower than it was when you started listening. Let me tell you how they found him. Part 1. The problem, what all the old tools could not do. To understand why genetic genealogy changed everything, you first need to understand why everything else had failed. By 2016, 40 years after the first documented East Area rapist attack in Sacramento, investigators had tried almost everything available to them, and they had done it with genuine dedication, genuine skill, and genuine resources. This was not a case that was neglected. This was a case that resisted. They had the DNA. That is the first and most important thing to understand. From the moment forensic DNA analysis became available to law enforcement in the late 1980s and early 1990s, investigators had been working with the biological material left at Golden State Killer crime scenes. They had built a complete DNA profile of the unknown perpetrator. It was in the system. It was accurate. It was available. What they did not have was a match. The standard law enforcement DNA database in the United States is called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, maintained by the FBI. CODIS contains the genetic profiles of individuals who have been convicted of crimes, arrested for certain offenses, or otherwise legally required to submit DNA samples. It is a database of known offenders, and it can only identify a perpetrator who is already in it. Joseph DeAngelo was not in it. He had never been convicted of a serious crime. The shoplifting arrest in 1979 was a misdemeanor, the kind of offense that did not, in that era, result in DNA collection. He had moved through the world for 40 years without ever providing a sample to any law enforcement database. His DNA was nowhere in CODIS, and so the profile that investigators had built from crime scene evidence sat in the system year after year, running against the available database, finding no match. They had also tried traditional investigative work. In the years following the crimes, investigators had looked at thousands of potential suspects. They had conducted interviews. They had used geographic profiling, a technique that uses the locations of crimes to estimate where an offender likely lived or worked. They had brought in criminal profilers. They had gone through old records and cross-referenced the physical description of the suspect. White male, athletic, late 20s to mid-30s, approximately 5 feet 9 to 6 feet, light brown or dirty blonde hair, against military records, against police records, against the records of anyone who had ever raised a flag in any of the affected jurisdictions. None of it had produced a name that held up. In 2003, venture capital businessman and brother of victim Keith Harrington, Bruce Harrington, testified before the California Assembly, pushing for expanded DNA collection. He argued that a larger DNA database would increase the chances of cold case identification. California did expand its collection requirements over the following years. It did not help in the Golden State Killer case, because the killer had still never provided a sample. By 2016, the case was receiving renewed attention. The FBI and the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office held a press conference on June 15, 2016, announcing a renewed nationwide effort to identify the killer, offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to identification. They released new composite sketches and additional crime details. The coverage was extensive. The public responded. Tips poured in. None of the tips led anywhere useful. And then, in the spring of 2017, something fundamentally different was tried. Something that had never been done before in a murder investigation. Something that would not just solve this case, but would change the entire landscape of what was possible in cold case investigation. Paul Holes picked up the phone and called Barbara Rae-Venter. Part 2. Barbara Rae-Venter, the woman who changed everything. Barbara Rae-Venter was born on July 17, 1948, in New Zealand. She holds a doctorate in biology. She trained as a patent attorney specializing in biotechnology inventions related to molecular biology, the precise intersection of science and law that would eventually make her uniquely positioned to do what no one else had done before. She spent decades as a patent attorney. She retired, and like many people who retire and suddenly find themselves with large quantities of unstructured time, she turned to a hobby, researching her family history. She became fascinated by genealogy, the science and art of tracing ancestry, building family trees, understanding the biological networks that connect human beings across generations and continents. Genealogy had been transformed by the internet and by the rise of direct-to-consumer DNA testing. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA had, in the early 2010s, made it possible for ordinary people to swab the inside of their cheek, mail the sample to a laboratory, and receive within weeks a detailed genetic profile showing their ancestry composition and identifying other users of the service who shared significant portions of their DNA, indicating family relationships ranging from siblings to distant cousins. Millions of people did this. By 2018, approximately 26 million people had taken some form of at-home ancestry DNA test. The databases of the major testing companies contain tens of millions of genetic profiles. And a free, open-source website called GeneMatch, founded by genealogy hobbyist Curtis Rogers and a colleague, allowed users to upload their raw DNA data files from any testing service and compare them against all other users of the site, regardless of which company had done the original test. GeneMatch was not a commercial operation in the way that 23andMe or Ancestry were. It was run by enthusiasts, for enthusiasts, as a resource for the genealogy community. Rae-Venter had been doing volunteer work for an organization that helped adoptees find their biological families using genetic genealogy. The basic logic was this. If an adopted person uploaded their DNA to a genealogy database and found partial matches, matches that indicated a second cousin, or a third cousin, or someone sharing a great-great-grandparent, a skilled genealogist could use those partial matches as starting points to build family trees, working backward to common ancestors and then forward again through different branches of the family, until the biological family of the adoptee was identified. It was patient, meticulous, methodical work. It required both genetic knowledge and traditional genealogical research skills. Census records, birth certificates, death records, marriage records, the kind of documentary paper trail that human lives leave behind. It was not simple, but in experienced hands, it was enormously powerful. Paul Holes had been following developments in genetic genealogy for years. He had watched the technique advance. He understood, in the abstract, that it might be applicable to criminal investigation. What he needed was someone who could actually do it, someone with the specific combination of genetic expertise, genealogical skill, and the ability to work under the conditions of a criminal investigation. He found Barbara Rae-Venter. He contacted her in March of 2017. He explained the case. He told her what they had: a complete DNA profile from crime scene evidence, decades old, belonging to a man whose identity remained unknown. He asked whether she thought genetic genealogy could find him. She thought about it. She agreed to try. She later described her initial motivation in characteristically direct terms. It was a puzzle. She was a scientist. Scientists are drawn to problems that have not been solved. This was one of the most famous unsolved problems in American criminal history. Of course, she said yes. What she was actually working with. The DNA that Rae-Venter was given to work with was not a simple sample. Crime scene DNA from decades-old cases can be degraded, contaminated, or limited in quantity. The biological material available from Golden State Killer crime scenes had been collected using the forensic methods of the 1970s and 1980s. Methods that were sophisticated for their time but that produced samples of varying quality and type. To upload a profile to a consumer genealogy database, the DNA sample first had to be converted into a format compatible with those databases. Consumer testing companies produce what is called a SNP profile. SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism, pronounced SNP, which identifies specific variations at particular locations across the genome. These are the most common type of genetic variation among people, and they are the currency of the consumer genealogy databases. The crime scene DNA was sent to a forensic laboratory. Family Tree DNA's lab was involved in this process, which extracted and processed the material to generate a SNP profile compatible with the genealogy databases. This was itself a significant technical achievement. The material available was not ideal, but the laboratory was able to produce a workable profile. Rae-Venter then uploaded the profile to GeneMatch and to other databases, including MyHeritage. And she waited to see who matched. Part 3. The Family Tree, Building from a Distant Cousin. The results that came back from GeneMatch were not, at first glance, immediately useful. There was no close match, no sibling, no parent, no first cousin who had uploaded their DNA and whose profile overlapped substantially with the crime scene sample. What there were instead were distant matches, partial overlaps, people who shared enough DNA with the crime scene profile to indicate a shared ancestor, but a distant one, a great-great-great-grandparent, perhaps. The kind of family connection that puts two people in the same extended family without them necessarily ever having met or known of each other's existence. 10 to 20 individuals emerged from the initial search as having significant partial matches with the crime scene profile. These were the distant relatives, the thread ends from which the family tree would have to be built. This is where the real work began. And it is here, in the methodical, painstaking, largely invisible work of genealogical research, that the case was actually solved. Rae-Venter took each partial match and began building outward. If person A shared enough DNA with the crime scene sample to indicate a common ancestor, The task was to identify that ancestor. She used traditional genealogical research tools, census records, birth and death certificates, marriage records, immigration records, newspaper archives, military records, the accumulated documentary evidence of American lives across generations, to build the family trees of the partial match individuals backward and upward until she found the shared ancestors. Then she built forward. From the common ancestor, a person who might have lived in the late 1800s or early 1900s, she traced every known descendant, every branch of the family, every generation, building a tree that might eventually include dozens or hundreds of living people, all of whom were biological relatives of the unknown crime scene contributor. From that tree, she then applied filters. The crime scene DNA told investigators certain things about the perpetrator beyond just his identity. The profile was consistent with a male contributor. The crimes dated to the 1970s and 1980s, which gave a rough age range for the perpetrator. Geographic information from the crimes suggested he had been present in California, specifically the Sacramento area and Southern California. These filters, male, born approximately between 1940 and 1960, with some connection to California, allowed Rae-Venter and the investigative team to narrow the large family tree down to a smaller set of candidates. One more filter was available, and it came from GEDmatch in a way that would have seemed remarkable in almost any other context. Rae-Venter was able to use the platform to predict the likely eye color of the crime scene DNA contributor. This is possible because certain gene variants are strongly associated with eye color. The analysis indicated that the unknown suspect most likely had blue eyes. Blue eyes, born approximately between 1940 and 1960. Connection to California. These filters, applied to the family tree that Rae-Venter had built from the distant cousin matches, produced a small number of candidates. Eventually, through a process of elimination, including ruling out one candidate when a relative's DNA test showed the family connection did not extend to the crime scene profile in the right way, 2 primary suspects remained. One was ruled out. The other was Joseph James D'Angelo. Rae-Venter pulled the California DMV records for the remaining candidates. She was looking for blue eyes. Only one of the men on her list had blue eyes on his driver's license record. It was Joseph D'Angelo. She sent the investigators an email. She told them she believed she had identified the Golden State Killer, and then she waited, alone at her computer in Marina, California, while investigators began the work of confirming what she had found. Part 4. The Man on Canyon Oak Drive. When the name Joseph James D'Angelo emerged from Rae-Venter's genealogical analysis in the spring of 2018, investigators did not immediately move to arrest. They could not. The genetic genealogy work had produced a name, a very strong name, a name supported by the family tree analysis and the eye color and the age and the California connection, but it had not produced the direct DNA match that would be needed for an arrest warrant and a successful prosecution. To make an arrest, they needed D'Angelo's own DNA. A sample that could be compared directly to the crime scene profile and that would either confirm or definitively rule out the identification. And they needed to get it without letting him know they were looking at him. This was not a trivial problem. D'Angelo was a former police officer. He had spent 6 years working in law enforcement. He had studied criminal justice at the university level. He understood, presumably better than most private citizens, the mechanics of investigation, what investigators looked for, how they worked, what kinds of mistakes could expose a suspect to scrutiny. If he had any reason to suspect that investigators were close to identifying him, he might flee. He might destroy evidence. He might, at worst, take actions that would endanger other people. The surveillance had to be invisible. Sacramento County Sheriff Scott Jones later said that law enforcement began surveillance of DeAngelo several days before his arrest, watching the house on Canyon Oak Drive, watching the routines of the man who lived there, watching for an opportunity to collect something he had discarded, something that carried his DNA, something that could be retrieved without his knowledge. They watched him, they followed him, and they waited. The Hobby Lobby. On April 18, 2018, 6 days before the arrest, investigators followed Joseph DeAngelo to a Hobby Lobby store in Roseville, California, about 3 miles from his Citrus Heights home. Hobby Lobby is an arts and crafts retail chain. It is the kind of store that sells picture frames and scrapbooking supplies and seasonal decorations and all the paraphernalia of domestic creativity. It is not, on its face, the kind of place one would expect to be the site of a crucial moment in one of the most significant criminal investigations in American history. But there it was. DeAngelo went into the store to shop. While he was inside, investigators moved to his car in the parking lot. With a swab, a simple swab of the kind used in forensic collection, they wiped the door handle of his car. Skin cells, saliva, the residue of contact. Whatever biological material a person's hand leaves on the surface they grip when they open a door. They took it to the laboratory. 2 days later, on April 20th, the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office Crime Lab returned its results from the car door swab. The analysis showed a mixture of 3 people's DNA on the handle, as you would expect from a car door that multiple people might have touched. But the person who had contributed the largest portion, 47% of the genetic material, produced a profile that was a match to the crime scene DNA from the March 1980 double homicide of Lyman and Charlene Smith in Ventura. 47%. From the handle of a car door. Outside a Hobby Lobby in Roseville. The car belonged to Joseph James DeAngelo, and the DNA on the door handle matched the Golden State Killer. But investigators wanted more. A car door handle is a surface that multiple people can touch. A defense attorney could argue contamination, could argue that the sample was compromised, could argue that the result was not conclusive. They wanted something cleaner, something that was unambiguously, exclusively from one person. They kept watching. The tissue. On April 23, 2018, 1 day before the arrest, investigators were outside the house on Canyon Oak Drive in Citrus Heights. 3 days of surveillance had established, to the satisfaction of the investigators watching, that DeAngelo was the only adult male present at the residence during that period. They knew the patterns of the household. They knew when the garbage was put out. When the trash was placed by the curb, investigators moved. They went through the items carefully, looking for something that carried the genetic material of a single identifiable person. They found a tissue, a used tissue, the kind of thing a person reaches for automatically, uses, and throws away without a second thought. Without any thought at all. A piece of everyday domestic life, discarded in a bin, that had absorbed the genetic signature of the man who used it. They took the tissue. They sent it to the laboratory. The results came back. It was a match. Clean, complete, unambiguous. The DNA from the tissue matched the Golden State Killer's crime scene profile with the precision that modern forensic science makes possible. The kind of result that, in a courtroom, would leave no serious room for doubt. The tissue was from Joseph James DeAngelo. And Joseph James DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. The search warrant was prepared. The arrest warrant was issued. Investigators from multiple agencies, Sacramento County Sheriff's Office, the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office, the FBI, and others coordinated the operation for the following day, April 24, 2018. Part 5. The morning of April 24, 2018. Picture what that morning looked like from the outside. Canyon Oak Drive is a quiet residential street in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. The houses are modest, single-story, California ranch style, the kind built in the 1970s and 1980s for working families who wanted a home with a garage and a yard. The street is lined with trees whose roots have over the decades pushed up sections of the sidewalk into gentle ridges. The neighborhood has the settled quality of a place where people have lived for a long time and intend to keep living. Number 8316 is where Joseph and Sharon D'Angelo bought their home on April 11, 1980. 41 years, 1 month, and 13 days before the morning of April 24, 2018, they had signed the papers on that house. He had been the East Area rapist then. He was already, that spring, planning the murder of Lyman and Charlene Smith in Ventura. He had bought this house in the suburb he had terrorized 4 years earlier and moved in and stayed. The irony of that address is almost too much to process. The first victim of the East Area rapist, the first documented attack, on June 18, 1976, had occurred in Citrus Heights. The house he bought in 1980 and lived in until his arrest in 2018 was in Citrus Heights. He had never left. He had never even moved very far from where he began. On the morning of April 24th, law enforcement was already in position. They were waiting for him to emerge from the house. They wanted to make the arrest outside, in the open, where they had clear sight lines and control of the environment. They were armed. They were ready. He came outside. What happened next has been described in various accounts by investigators and in the subsequent court filings. D'Angelo was taken into custody without incident. He did not run. He did not resist. There was no dramatic confrontation, no chase, no struggle. He was an old man being arrested, and the overwhelming force of what surrounded him left him with no meaningful choice. He reportedly appeared confused, disoriented. He muttered something along the lines of, "I don't know what's happening." He knew. Whatever he said in that moment, he knew. He had known, perhaps at some level, that this moment had always been possible. That the thing he had done could not be entirely hidden forever. And now the moment had come, and the confusion, whether real or performed, was all he had left. He was taken to a police vehicle. He was transported to the Sacramento County Main Jail, where he was booked in the early hours of the morning on 2 initial counts of murder, the February 1978 shooting deaths of Brian and Katie Majori in Rancho Cordova. A Ventura County arrest warrant had been issued for the murders of Lyman and Charlene Smith. More charges would follow. FBI agents arrived at Canyon Oak Drive. They began gathering evidence from the house. The house that had been an ordinary house on an ordinary street for 40 years. The house where 3 daughters had grown up. The house where the newspaper arrived in the morning and the lawn was mowed on Saturdays and the neighbors waved and nothing indicated what the man inside had done. What he said to himself. At some point after his arrest, before the full machinery of his legal representation was in place, Joseph D'Angelo was left alone in a police interrogation room. The room was equipped with recording devices, as interrogation rooms typically are. And what he said to himself, alone in that room, believing he was not being listened to, was captured. Sacramento County Prosecutor Tien Ho later described, at D'Angelo's plea hearing in 2020, what had been recorded in that room. D'Angelo said, "I did all that." He said, "I didn't have the strength to push him out. He made me. He went with me. It was like in my head. I mean, he's a part of me. I didn't want to do those things. I pushed Jerry out and had a happy life. I did all those things. I destroyed all their lives. So now I've got to pay the price. He had given the part of himself that had done these things a name. Jerry was the part of him that had broken into homes and tied people up and killed 10 people and raped over 50 others. Jerry was the darkness. Joseph was the mechanic, the neighbor, the father, the man who mowed the lawn. Prosecutors did not accept this framing, and they were direct about why. Tien Ho told the court that D'Angelo had feigned feeble incoherence with detectives during the arrest, despite having appeared perfectly sharp and alert during the days of surveillance before it. Criminologist James Allen Fox of Northeastern University, who commented on the case publicly, noted that serial killers who maintain a double life for years, who plan, stalk, strike, and disappear over and over without detection, are by definition not people who are incapacitated by a dissociative inner voice. Someone who suffers from a serious mental illness isn't capable of that, Fox said. Serial killers who blame an alter ego for their crimes are usually faking it. It's self-serving for someone to suggest that they did all of these things because of this voice. Don't blame me, blame the voice. D'Angelo had used the same tactic before. When he was arrested for shoplifting in 1979, the hammer, the dog repellent, he had acted confused and incoherent in an attempt to avoid the full consequences of the charge. He had done it then. He was doing it again. The performance of helplessness was as deliberate as everything else he had ever done. But the recorded words remained, "I did all that." He admitted it to himself, in the dark, when he thought no one was listening. As he had always done things in the dark, believing he would not be found. He was wrong. Part 6, April 25, 2018, The World Finds Out. The announcement was made the following day, April 25, 2018. At a press conference in Sacramento, Sacramento County District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert stood before cameras and reporters and the assembled representatives of the multiple agencies that had worked the case. She said, "We all knew we were looking for a needle in a haystack, but we also knew the needle was there." She said, "It is fitting that today is National DNA Day. We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento." The announcement broke like a wave. The news went everywhere, through social media and cable news and newspapers in languages across the world. The Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. The man who had been one of the most famous unidentified criminals in American history was now identified. He was in custody. He was 72 years old. He was a former police officer. He had been living in Citrus Heights, the same neighborhood where the East Area Rapist had committed his first documented attack 42 years earlier. The reactions were immediate, overwhelming, and deeply varied. Bruce Harrington, whose brother Keith and sister-in-law Patrice had been murdered in Dana Point in 1980, and who had spent decades advocating for expanded DNA collection in California, stood at the press conference and said, "To the entire reservoir of victims out there, my sadness is with you. For the 51 ladies who were brutally raped in these crimes, sleep better tonight. He isn't coming through the window. He's now in jail and he's history." Investigators who had worked the case for years, some of them for their entire careers, responded with a range of emotions that defied easy summary. Relief, a complicated joy that was inseparable from the sadness of everything the case had cost. Paul Holes, who had retired 2 days earlier, received the news that would have ended his career on the highest possible note if the timing had been slightly different. He cried. He has said in subsequent interviews that he cried for a long time. Carol Daly, the Sacramento County investigator who had spent years sitting with rape survivors in the 1970s, gathering their accounts, trying to build a usable picture of the man who had done this to them, learned that the man was in custody. She was in her 70s by then. She had spent decades wondering whether justice would come. It had come. Survivors of the attacks, women who had been assaulted in their beds in Sacramento in 1976 and 1977 and 1978, who had spent decades carrying what had been done to them, who had in many cases never stopped looking over their shoulders or never stopped flinching at sounds in the night, now had a name, now had a face, now had the knowledge that the man who had done this to them was in a jail cell. Jane Carson Sandler, who had been attacked in October 1976 while her 3-year-old son was in the same room, was one of the first survivors to speak publicly. She later said that she had never water skied again after the attack. D'Angelo had told her during the assault that he had seen her at a lake and she looked good, and that specific detail had made the thing she had loved since she was 3 years old impossible. She could not put on a ski mask. She could not hear someone yell, "Shut up," without her heart accelerating. She had spent over 40 years managing the aftermath of a single night in 1976. And now she knew who had done it. That knowledge, she said, was not nothing. It was not everything, but it was not nothing. Part 7. The charges, what he was accused of. In the weeks and months following the arrest, charges were filed across multiple counties. The scope of what was being alleged, laid out in legal language in successive court filings, produced a document that was staggering in its cumulative weight. 13 counts of first-degree murder. 13 kidnapping charges for purposes of robbery. Special circumstances including murder committed during the commission of a burglary, murder committed during the commission of a rape. The filings represented the murders that had occurred within the statute of limitations for prosecution, murders, which in California have no statute of limitations. The rapes, 51 documented attacks, possibly more, could not be charged. California's statute of limitations for rape in the 1970s was 3 years. 3 years. The evidence had been collected. The victims had reported. The files had been maintained. But the law, as it existed at the time the crimes were committed, set a clock on those offenses, and that clock had expired decades ago. There would be no formal criminal accountability for what had been done to those women in their beds in Sacramento and the Bay Area. This was a source of profound pain for many survivors. To know that the man who had attacked them was facing trial, was going to stand in a courtroom and have to reckon with what he had done, but that what had been done specifically to them would never appear on any charge sheet, would never be formally acknowledged in a legal proceeding, was a particular kind of injustice that sat on top of the original injustice. The law has since changed in California. In 2016, California eliminated the statute of limitations for rape and other sexual offenses. If the East Area rapist had committed his crimes after that change, if everything had happened 20 years later, he could have faced criminal charges for every assault. But the change came too late for his victims. The timing of their suffering, the particular years in which it occurred, determined what justice the system could formally offer them. What the system could offer by 2018 was the 13 murder charges, and the commitment that the prosecutors made, publicly and in court, that the voices of the rape survivors would be heard, that even if they could not be formal complainants in the criminal proceedings, they would have the opportunity to speak. They did, and when they spoke, it was one of the most powerful things the Sacramento courtroom had ever contained. Part 8, The Long Wait, 2018 to 2020. Between D'Angelo's arrest in April 2018 and his eventual guilty plea in June 2020, almost exactly 2 years passed. 2 years during which he sat in custody, was represented by legal counsel, and said almost nothing publicly. The legal proceedings moved at the pace that complex criminal cases move, which is to say, slowly, with many hearings and continuances and procedural steps that are meaningful in legal terms but opaque to the public watching from the outside. There were questions about the scope of the charges. There were discussions about the death penalty. California had not executed anyone since 2006, and a moratorium on executions was in effect, but the death penalty remained a legal option for crimes of this severity. The district attorneys from multiple counties had to coordinate their approaches. The families of the murder victims had strong feelings about the death penalty. Some supported it fiercely. Ron Harrington said his family believed D'Angelo was the poster child for the death penalty. Others were less certain. The particular complication was age. D'Angelo was 72 at the time of his arrest. Even if a death sentence were imposed and eventually carried out, the years of appeals and legal proceedings that typically separate a death sentence from an execution in California would almost certainly mean that he would die of natural causes before any execution could occur. The question of whether pursuing the death penalty was worth the additional trauma it would place on victims and families, weighed against the practical reality that it might never be carried out, was one that prosecutors wrestled with seriously. In March of 2020, D'Angelo offered to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence. Prosecutors initially rejected the deal. They wanted to preserve the option of seeking the death penalty. But by June of 2020, with the negotiations continuing and with input from the victims and families who had been consulted throughout, an agreement was reached. He would plead guilty. He would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never be eligible for release. In exchange for this certainty, the certainty that he would spend the rest of his life in prison rather than facing years of death penalty appeals and retrials, the prosecution would not seek execution. Most of the victims and families, when consulted, accepted this as the best available outcome. Not justice. They were nearly universal in acknowledging that true justice was not achievable, that nothing could restore what had been taken, that a plea deal and a life sentence were not justice, but something more like the closest the system could get. Jennifer Carroll, Lyman Smith's daughter, said it directly in court. Justice is not possible in this case. She was right, and she said it anyway. Stood in the courtroom and looked at the man who had bludgeoned her father to death with a piece of firewood and said the truest thing. Justice is not possible. And then she said her piece. And the survivors and the families all said their pieces. And that was the closest thing to justice the law could produce. Part 9. June 29, 2020, The Plea. The plea hearing on June 29, 2020 was held in a university ballroom, not a traditional courtroom. This was a concession to the COVID-19 pandemic. The proceedings required a space large enough to accommodate, with appropriate physical distancing, the dozens of survivors and family members who had been waiting for this moment. A university ballroom could hold them. A courtroom could not. Joseph James D'Angelo arrived in a wheelchair. He was 74 years old. He was wearing a white face mask, also a concession to pandemic protocols. He was covered. He was diminished in the physical way that all old men are diminished, smaller and frielier than the composite sketches of an athletic man in his late 20s that investigators had been circulating for decades. The judge read the 26 charges to which D'Angelo was pleading guilty. For each one, D'Angelo was required to say something, to acknowledge in some form the charge against him. His voice was described by those present as hushed, raspy, barely audible. He said, "Guilty" in that voice. Over and over. Quietly. Almost inaudibly. He also admitted, as part of the plea agreement, to dozens of uncharged offenses, the rapes that could not be formally prosecuted because of the statute of limitations, the additional crimes that the record supported but that fell outside what could be formally charged. He could not be convicted of those things. But he admitted to them. They are part of the legal record of what he did. And then the hearing was over, and the plea was entered, and Joseph James DeAngelo was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. There was no celebration in that ballroom. There was not the kind of relief that crime dramas suggest. The gasp, the tears of joy, the sense of resolution. What there was instead was something quieter and more complicated. Something that the people who were there have tried, in various interviews and statements since, to describe, and have found that it resists description. A closing, not an ending. Nothing could end the 40 years of what these people had carried. But a closing. A door finally shut on the question of whether the system would ever formally acknowledge what had been done. It had. In a raspy, barely audible voice, the man responsible had said the word, "Guilty." Part 10. The sentencing, August 2020, The Voices. The formal sentencing took place in August of 2020, across 3 days of victim impact statements that preceded the judge's final imposition of sentence on August 21st. These 3 days, in a Sacramento courtroom, conducted with the logistical complexity that the pandemic required, were, by the accounts of everyone present and everyone who has read or watched the proceedings since, among the most extraordinary things to occur in an American courtroom in recent memory. 53 people gave statements. Survivors of the Sacramento rapes. Family members of the murder victims. People who had been waiting for this opportunity for 40, even 44 years. DeAngelo sat in a wheelchair throughout most of the proceedings. He turned away from the speakers, away from the people he had wronged, away from the faces of those whose lives he had destroyed. The Ventura County District Attorney, Gregory Totten, noted this with a directness that landed. His crimes were always committed in the dark of night, and it was common for him to cover lights. Even now here in this courtroom, he turns away from the light and dare not face or look at his accusers, for fear that the truth of their testimonies might penetrate the deep darkness. Peggy Frink, who had been 15 years old when DeAngelo attacked her and her 16-year-old sister in their Sacramento County home in July of 1976, stood before him and said, "My God, we were just high school kids living a normal life." She described how she had been bound so tightly that her hands remained numb for months. She described the difficulty of brushing her hair afterward, the pain that lingered in her scalp. She was in her late 50s by then, standing in a Sacramento courtroom, telling a 74-year-old man what he had done to a 15-year-old girl. Jane Carson Sandler, who had been attacked in October 1976 with her 3-year-old son in the room, addressed DeAngelo directly. "You will not defeat me, you will not break me," she told him. She paused her prepared remarks to look at him and said, with a composure that was more devastating than any fury could have been, "I see your eyes are closing." He appeared to be slumping, pretending inattention or unconsciousness. She saw it. She called it out. She continued speaking. Gay Hardwick, who had been attacked in March of 1978 with her now husband, described in precise and terrible detail what DeAngelo had done to her. He had kidnapped her from her bed. He had raped her repeatedly. He had eaten from her refrigerator. He had drunk 2 beers while she lay bound and blindfolded. He had ransacked the home and tormented her with threats throughout. He ate from my refrigerator and he drank 2 beers while I lay bound and blindfolded, she said, and the ordinariness of the details, the beers, the refrigerator, the domestic normalcy of what he had helped himself to in the home of the person he was brutalizing, was perhaps more chilling than anything more dramatically violent could have been. Pete Schulze, whose mother Winnie had been attacked in October 1976 while he and his sister were in the house, described his mother's 44 years of fear. He told the court that on the night D'Angelo was arrested, the night in April 2018 when Pete called to tell her that they had caught the man, it was probably the first night in 44 years that Winnie Schulze slept. The first night in 44 years. Let that be understood in its full weight. 44 years of nights. 44 years of checking locks and listening to sounds in the dark and knowing that the man who had done what was done to her was still somewhere in the world, still unidentified, still free. 44 years of that specific, private terror. And then one night in April 2018, her son called to say it was over, and for the first time since 1976, she slept. Jennifer Carroll, the daughter of murder victim Lyman Smith, stood before D'Angelo and told him that she had been a suspect in her father's murder for 2 days when she was 18 years old. She had lived with that shame for decades, the shame that was not hers, that had been placed on her by circumstance and misdirected suspicion, and the simple fact that investigators in 1980 had no way of knowing who had really done it. "It's your shame, Joe," she told him. She returned it to him across the courtroom. She named what it was and who it belonged to, and she said it looking at his face, which was turned away from her, because he could not look at the people he had wronged. Chris Pedretti, Chris McFarlane, as she had been in December 1976 when D'Angelo attacked her at 15, while she was practicing the piano, described what the attack had done to the girl she had been. "This kid who liked to go shopping and do cartwheels on the lawn," she said, "that girl was gone. She had lost friends. She had switched schools 3 times. She had had 2 failed marriages. She had, as she put it, done a lot of self-medicating. And she had survived. And she was standing there. And she wanted him to know that she had survived." The Sacramento District Attorney, Anne Marie Schubert, spoke in closing. She addressed the survivors directly, reaching back to the specific details of the victim impact statements she had just witnessed. "Paint your children and your grandchildren's rooms again with hearts and rainbows. Water ski again." She was telling them that they could take back the things he had taken. That the woman who had not water skied since 1976 could water ski again. That the person who had repainted their child's room in darker colors after the attack, a detail from one of the statements, could paint it back. That the life he had reached into and rearranged could be rearranged again, on their terms, in their way. She quoted Chris Pedretti's statement in addressing D'Angelo directly, "Your name will fade from the headlines." It was both true and a final diminishment. The reduction of the person who had believed himself invisible and unreachable to someone whose name would eventually mean nothing. Part 11. August 21, 2020, the sentence. The sentence was imposed on August 21, 2020 by Sacramento County Superior Court Judge Michael Bowman. Multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Joseph James D'Angelo would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would die there. He would never again be in a position to harm another person. He would never again park his car in a neighborhood and watch the houses. He would never again unlock a window from the inside and return hours later. He would never again put dishes on a man's back or take a piece of firewood from a stack outside a house and use it as a weapon. Never again. Before sentencing, he was given the opportunity to speak. He rose from his wheelchair. He removed his face mask. And Joseph James D'Angelo, standing in the courtroom that he had filled for 3 days with the voices of the people he had wronged, said this: "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt. Thank you, Your Honor." That was all. 15 words of apology. No explanation, no context, no acknowledgement of specific individuals or specific acts. No attempt to address any of the people who had spent 3 days telling him what he had done to them. 15 words, in the same raspy, barely audible voice. The courtroom received it in silence. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer, in his remarks that day, said, "I honestly believe that this person, not even a person, this beast, deserved the ultimate punishment of death. But we met with our victims. We knew the age of the case. We knew how long it took to solve. And we knew that this was the right thing to do." He also said, "For the victims whose voices have been stolen and the family members who sadly ran out of time and could not make it here today, I want you to know that there are 13 angels watching us today." 13. The 13 people he had murdered. Brian and Katie Majori, walking their dog. Claude Snelling, defending his daughter. Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning. Lyman and Charlene Smith. Keith and Patrice Harrington. Manuela Withun. Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez. And Janelle Cruz, 18 years old, home alone for the summer, who heard a noise outside and thought it was a cat. 13. And the courtroom held the weight of all of them. Part 12. The Science That Opened a Door. The Golden State Killer case was the first in American history to be solved using investigative genetic genealogy. It was not the last. The technique, once proven, spread rapidly through law enforcement. Since April 2018, investigative genetic genealogy has been used to initiate investigations in more than 50 criminal cases across the United States, nearly all involving homicides or sexual assaults. By some estimates, over 39 additional cold case arrests have been made using information from GeneMatch alone in the years following D'Angelo's arrest. Unidentified human remains have been identified. Families have received answers about relatives who had been missing for decades. The technique created, and continues to create, a genuine and important ethical debate. And that debate deserves to be taken seriously, because the questions it raises are real. When Barbara Rae-Venter uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA to GeneMatch in 2017, she was comparing it against profiles uploaded by individuals who had joined GeneMatch voluntarily, people who wanted to trace their family history, who had no idea that their genetic information might one day be used to identify a distant relative as a criminal suspect. They had not consented to that use. They had not been told it was possible. Their genetic data was not their own in any simple sense. It was also, inevitably, partly the genetic data of their relatives, their children, their parents, their cousins, none of whom had uploaded anything or agreed to anything. GeneMatch's founder Curtis Rogers said, after the announcement, that he was not totally comfortable with his platform having been used in this way, but that he felt it was important for users to understand the possible uses of the site so they could make their own decisions. In the wake of the Golden State Killer case, GeneMatch changed its terms of service to require users to explicitly opt in to allow their profiles to be used in law enforcement investigations, a change that an estimated 80% of users did not make, dramatically reducing the size of the database available for forensic searches. A survey conducted by the Baylor College of Medicine found that 91% of respondents supported law enforcement using consumer DNA databases to solve violent crimes. But 91% of survey respondents is not the same as 91% of DNA database users, And the distinction matters. The people who had not consented, who had no meaningful way to consent, are part of this calculation. Amy McGuire, the director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine, articulated the tension carefully. There is a genuine tension between wanting to protect consumers and be respectful of their wishes and recognizing that working with law enforcement provides a social benefit. That tension is real. Both sides of it are real, and it is not going to resolve itself simply. What we can say with certainty is this: the technique works. It found Joseph DeAngelo when 40 years of every other method had not. It has since found others, people who committed terrible crimes and believed, with excellent reason, that the distance between themselves and detection was sufficient to last their lifetimes. The tool has shrunk that distance dramatically. Whether the terms under which it is used can be shaped in a way that adequately respects the privacy of the millions of innocent people whose DNA exists in these databases is a question that legislators, ethicists, and the genealogy community are still working through. Barbara Rae-Venter, for her part, has said she believes the use of genetic genealogy to identify violent criminals is a clear social good. She wrote a book about the case, published in 2023, titled, "I Know Who You Are: How an Amateur DNA Sleuth Unmasked the Golden State Killer and Changed Crime Fighting Forever." She has given interviews and talks. She has become, in retirement, unexpectedly famous. The retired patent attorney from New Zealand who changed the history of criminal investigation without ever leaving her home. She still describes solving the case as a puzzle. She solved the puzzle, and then she went to play tennis. Part 13, Paul Holes and the 2 Days. I want to come back to Paul Holes, because his story deserves more than a mention. Paul Holes spent 24 years working for Contra Costa County law enforcement. A significant portion of those years, more than 2 decades by his own account, were shaped by the Golden State Killer case. He was not the only investigator who worked it, but he became its most visible long-term champion. The person who kept pushing, who kept finding new angles, who kept believing that the case could be solved when it would have been entirely understandable to conclude that it could not. He was a DNA expert and forensic investigator. He understood the science at a deep level. He was the one who, in 2017, reached out to Barbara Rae-Venter and asked whether genetic genealogy might work. He was the one who maintained the relationship with the genealogy team through the months of research that followed. He was deeply involved in the investigative work that led to DeAngelo's identification. He retired from his position on March 15, 2018. He had been ill. He had a health issue that he has discussed publicly in subsequent interviews, and the time had come to leave. He left. He attended a retirement gathering with colleagues and friends. 9 days later, on April 24, 2018, Joseph DeAngelo was arrested. 2 days after Holes' retirement, he did not find out until the day after the arrest. He was no longer on the distribution list. He learned when someone called him to tell him. And then he sat with what it felt like to have spent 24 years, to have devoted a significant portion of his professional life, his analytical energy, his intellectual obsession, to a case that was solved 2 days after he retired. He cried. He has said this without embarrassment in multiple interviews and public appearances. He cried and he was glad and he was sad and he was proud and he was gutted by the timing, all at once. Because that is what 2 days means when the work has taken 24 years. He has since become a public figure in the true crime world. A podcast host, a consultant, a person who brings the specific gravity of someone who has actually done this work, at this level, for this long, to the conversations that the public has about crime and investigation. He has handled the fame with a particular kind of groundedness that comes from knowing that the real thing is more complicated, more exhausting, and more important than any public narrative about it can fully capture. He is not a hero in the simple sense that the word suggests. He is a human being who did hard, painstaking work for a long time, who cared about the outcome in a way that was personal as well as professional, and who got the outcome, just barely, just outside the official frame of his career that he had been working toward. That is enough. It is more than enough. Closing. We have come a long way tonight. We have followed the signs from a crime scene to a genealogy database to a retired patent attorney's computer in Marina, California. We have watched investigators build a family tree from a distant cousin match, narrow it down through census records and driver's license files, arrive at a name. We have stood outside a Hobby Lobby in Roseville, watching a man go inside to shop while the swab was taken from his car door. We have been at the curb on Canyon Oak Drive when the tissue came out of the trash. We have been in the ballroom on April 24, 2018, and in the University Ballroom in June 2020, and in the Sacramento courtroom in August 2020, when the man who had lived with this secret for 44 years was finally made to account for it. The story is not quite finished. Volume 4 will take us into the cold decades, the long years between 1986 and 2018 when D'Angelo was simply a mechanic and a neighbor and a grandfather, while the people he had harmed kept living with what he had done. We will spend time with the community of investigators and amateur researchers who built the foundation on which the genetic genealogy could work. We will go deeper into what the case changed, for law enforcement, for the DNA industry, for the families still seeking answers in cold cases across the country. But that is for another night. Tonight you have held something heavy and important. You have followed the story of how a man who believed himself invisible was found by a piece of technology he had never anticipated, and a woman who thought she was going to spend her retirement playing tennis. You have been in rooms where people said things that will stay in the record forever. You have been in the presence of justice that was imperfect and late and insufficient and still meaningful. Still necessary. Still worth everything it took to arrive. Now rest. The rain is still falling. It has been falling all this time and it asks nothing of you. It simply falls and it fills the silence and it makes a sound that the brain recognizes deep in its oldest wiring as permission to stop. So stop. Let the story rest. Let your mind drift away from courtrooms in California and the specific weight of 40 years of unanswered questions. Let it go to somewhere simpler. You are in a warm place. You are safe. The world outside is doing what it does. And there is nothing left to figure out tonight. So I will be here in Volume 4 when you are ready.